Thank you very much. I think it was a really great lecture, and through this initiative of the OEWG, you clarified a lot of very important aspects of the terminology, safety, security, dual use, dual purpose, classifying different threats. I think that's really very useful and very welcome to be able to discuss properly now. So we have 3 questions that were submitted. The 3 questions actually were submitted by my colleague Yuri Takaya. So Yuri, if you would like to, because we are a small group, so if you would like to ask them directly, you can raise your hand. If not, I will at least start to read the first one. Okay, yes, you raised your hand. Let me authorize you to talk. Okay.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for such a comprehensive presentation. Can you hear me? Could you please confirm?
Yes.
Yes.
We can hear you.
So, well, since 2008, I was following the team space security. And the thing is, it seems that the concept or definition of space security seems shifting from 10 years ago to now. For instance, when the September 11th terrorist attacks was occurred in the US, then US launched the concept of space security. And at that time, they used this term in the context of national security. And still, I think like Japan, or we use the term in the context of national security. But on the other hand, from your presentation or current UN discussion in UN, it seems like they now are aware of this. There's a common threat. Then they try to, I don't know, the definition of space security seems shifting to embrace other states' security also. So then I really wondered, because from the document, UNIDIR organizes the space security symposium and so on. So I see many documents or events that UNIDIR use this term. But on the other hand, the first committee or WG, they use the reducing threat in outer space and so on. So if there is such a shift, if you noticed, could you please share it with me, with us? Thank you.
Sure. Should I answer this question first, or do we want to go?
Yes, let's go question by question. I think it's better. So you can start with this one.
This is a really good question. And I think this goes into the difference, not so much that the UN has shifted the way it sees space security, but rather what we consider to be space security at the multilateral level and what we consider space security to be at the domestic level. I think, so yes, UNIDIR definitely uses the term space security, but this is not a UNIDIR term, so to say. This is definitely a UN term. It's used at the UN at large. It's very much recognized and used by individual states. And it's used in the context, as I was saying, of, it's different from space safety. It refers to threats posed by intentional actions by actors in outer space. And this definitely has a national security component, 100%. This is true. And when states themselves are talking about space security, they definitely refer to national security concerns. And when they want to address space security issues, it's definitely due to their own national security interests and national security concerns. But this is not incompatible, and it should not be seen as incompatible with embracing or considering the security of other states also. Not just because states have allies, and the national security interests of one state could also be perfectly aligned with the national security interest of its allies, but also because even with states that are not necessarily allies, states that might be near peer competitors or that might be rivals, they could have similar interests in terms of security, right? Space debris, for example, we were talking about space debris. This is a concern for I would say for all states. It's true that for some it might be a bigger priority than for others, but it's definitely a concern for everyone in terms of space debris being able to affect the services that any satellites, irrespective of who it belongs to, the services that satellites can provide to Earth. So, for example, if there is debris, if there is a state that uses a kinetic weapon to destroy a satellite, and this action creates debris, that debris is going to be completely indiscriminate. It's not going to choose, okay, I'm gonna destroy your satellites, but not the satellites of this other state. No, it's gonna affect everything in its path. And so that is a security concern for all states. So I agree with you that there is a difference in national security versus the security of other states. And this is definitely something that states individually consider when they issue their own policies, when they establish their own relationships with each other, when they establish their list of priorities of what issues to tackle at the multilateral stage. But there is also the international security component that doesn't necessarily have to be sort of contrary or incompatible to national security. And when we at the UN level talk about space security, that is mostly what we are concerned about. Even though we do acknowledge that, sure, states will have their own national security concerns. When we talk about space security, when we create initiatives like, for example, this group, sure, this initiative was first proposed by the UK, but once the resolution was approved, this became a UN process. And so this UN process led to the creation of a UN secretariat for the group. And so, for example, me as part of this secretariat, I cannot consider individual national security concerns because that would make the secretariat partial to like the interests of some over the interests of others. So we have to consider international security at large. What is important for everyone? What recommendations could be adopted in consensus to benefit the international community as a whole, if that makes sense. I hope that answers your question, but please do let me know if I should clarify.
Thank you so much. I hope in the OEWG report, the definition would be tried to put in. And thank you so much. And I move to the second question. Yes, always the OST, Outer Space Treaty, or TCVM documents, any kind of guidelines or code of conduct, they have the clause that states should or recommended to share information to enhance the transparency and so on. But in reality, UN doesn't have the function to verify one by the information, and particularly about the registration of the space object. And just there's some they need to just inform the character or function of a space object, and then normally they do not say this is for anti-satellite test and so on. So just the states provide general information, this is a commercial communication and so on. So, well, there are many instruments they have, but if the UN does not have the function to verify any information, it does not substantially serve to reducing the space threat. And what do you think?
Okay, perfect. Thank you. That is also a very good question. Before I tackle that, I wanted to go back to the definition question that you asked at the very end of before posing this second question. I don't think there is an official UN definition for what space security is, but I would direct you, if you're looking for a definition that could be useful, I would direct you to the working paper that UNIDIR submitted to the second session of the OEWG. You can find it on the website of the OEWG. This working paper, I will try to find it and put it in the chats for all of you in case that's useful too. But this working paper sort of gives definitions of, you know, what is space safety and what is space security. What do states generally mean when they use the term space safety and space security? Then having said that, to move to your second question, if I understood correctly, if I understand, there are like two sides to this question. Firstly, is the registration issue, like how do we know that every state is registering their objects as what, you know, as per what the UN treaties, but specifically the registration convention states. And also, how can we, and the second side of the question would be, how can we verify that these soft law mechanisms like these TCBMs are being complied with? Is that correct? Would that be like a good sort of summary of your question?
I think that I do not stick to the registration of the space object. Just I wanted to point out that any kind of instrument so far says we have to share information, but I don't know to what extent we make sure if it's the correct information and so on. Okay.
Actually, the issue of verification is something that has come up multiple times in OEWG discussions. When states have proposed legally binding mechanisms specifically, one of the criticisms that has been brought up by other states is that any legally binding mechanism has to be verifiable. So verification is a huge concern. In terms of how do we know what's up there? So far, it's true that we have the registration convention, but as you probably know, the requirements of what you have to report to the registry are not very extensive. It's just basically basic information, and not everybody complies by it. I think we have right now, I don't know this number by heart. I know it's over 80% compliance with it in terms of what is up there and what has already been registered. But I don't think it quite reaches the percentage of 90%. So it's improved in the last few years, but it's true that not everything is registered. In terms of more than that could be done, something that has been proposed by many states is using SSA technology to sort of verify or to like kind of monitor what is out there. SSA stands for Space Situational Awareness, and essentially this would be like a set of telescopes on Earth, or even some technology in space that could be used to kind of like see what different objects are in orbit, where they are moving, what they are doing, and sort of through these images we would be able to keep track of where they are. And sure, SSA could be a very useful way to not knowing, we wouldn't know exactly what the object is, but we could infer its use by knowing the orbit of the object, the movement that it carries out, whether it maneuvers between different orbits, whether it approaches different objects. So there is a certain degree of information that could be extracted through SSA technology, and through using this, you could use this as a sort of verification tool that states are complying with treaties, or as a monitoring tool that states are heeding the recommendations of TCBMs. Because in this sense, it's important to make the distinction between monitoring and verification. You cannot verify non-legally binding mechanisms. Only treaties can be verified. And when you're talking about soft law, the term that you would be using is monitoring of those tools, of those yes, non-legally binding mechanisms. But again, even though SSA is incredibly useful, an issue that has been raised with regards to the use of SSA for verification monitoring purposes is that SSA just provides you with data. You then have to interpret the data it might not be enough. So you have to use SSA in conjunction with other types of mechanisms, with, for example, notifications of launches. This might make the task of verifying or monitoring compliance with a mechanism a lot easier than if you just have the SSA data, if that makes any sense. Or notifications of the maneuvering of a satellite, or states providing information, like more detailed information beyond what the registration convention dictates, a bit of more detailed information on the uses of a satellite. For example, is this going to be a satellite that is going to be used for gathering imagery? Is this going to be a GPS? Is this going to be a satellite that will fulfill military and civilian functions at the same time? So those pieces of information can be very useful in terms of keeping track of compliance, of verification, monitoring, etc. So I hope that was useful and sort of replies to what you were asking.
Yeah, it is so clear. Thank you so much. Sorry, Kantan, I spent too much time. Only a
No, it's perfect. Please go on with your third question.
Thank you so much. Question 3. Since the Paris Committee was established, and it seems that Russia and China always stick to making a treaty, and they do not try to show any, compromise in making some soft approach. So once I interviewed one from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he answered, maybe in the domestic legal mechanism of Russia or China, maybe they need a treaty to implement international obligation. But I don't know if that's the correct answer. So if you know, if there is some specific reason, apart from like a political performance, if there's a reason, could you please share it with us? Thank you so much.
And I will combine this question actually to the one that was submitted by Kazuto Suzuki, who, by the way, had to leave because he's teaching a course from 1 p.m. Japan time. But so he says, hi, Almudena, I have a class to teach in a few minutes, so I cannot ask you directly. My question is, given the rivalry between the US and China-Russia, how do you see the OEWG's sustainability? And what are the motivation of these countries to participate while rivals are in the same forum?
Oh, that is a very good question. Both of those questions are really good. So, I mean, these are complicated issues. You never know what's going to happen, right? What I can say is that we've been very encouraged so far by how the 2 first sessions of the OEWG have gone. Sure, it's not perfect. States have different opinions. It's clear that states like Russia and China have very different priorities to a state like the United States. But they nevertheless, all 3 of them are part of the group. They are actively engaging in the process. They are raising their points of concern, and they are making their opinions known. They are proposing solutions. So in that sense, it's really encouraging that you have all these players in the room, and all of them want to be part of the process, even if not all of them voted in favor of the process initially. So that is really encouraging. We don't know how this will result. We also have to acknowledge that the OEWG doesn't happen in a geopolitical vacuum. So there, you have other processes that are going on at the UN as well that could influence the outcome of this specific process. You have the geopolitical relations at large that could again influence how this process turns out. So we really don't know what's going to happen. But so far, I remain cautiously optimistic. I do think that the more ambitious we want to get in terms of the more detailed we want to get with the recommendations, if we want recommendations that are very specific, it might be harder, it might take longer to negotiate those. So for the more contentious issues, we might have to remain a bit more general. We have to essentially, I think that the goal for this OEWG should be to try to build common understanding. We don't have to have a perfect set of recommendations. We don't have to have a perfect set of these are going to be the things that will rule space security for the next whatever many years. It's more about the process of bringing everybody together, and to make sure that we are all on the same page in terms of what we understand space security concerns to be. So something like this space debris space apologies, the direct ascent kinetic ASAT resolution is a good example of common understanding. Sure, not everybody voted in favor of this resolution, but it nevertheless highlights that, you know, space debris is a concern for many states. And there will be other similar recommendations or issues that will be raised, hopefully, in the future that will lead to something similar. In terms of why Russia and China insist on having a legally binding mechanism, I do have to point out they are not the only ones. There are many states for whom this is really important. I think it's because treaties are seen as the source of the ultimate goal in lawmaking. So when you're thinking about a law, even at the domestic level, for example, let's think. I think it's very easy to sort of picture this when you think about criminal law. So criminal law is like when you have a law that says do not kill. If it's a binding law, you kind of like take it more seriously. If it's the state recommending you, like, you could potentially kill somebody, but we prefer that you don't. It's not as strong, right? There isn't a strong incentive for a person to follow that law. So I think when you move that to the international sphere, there is a similar effect. When you have a treaty, a treaty is the reflection of consensus at the international level among all of the signatories that we want 100% to comply with this thing that we said we were going to do. So it's seen as sort of like more certain. There is more certainty that in the minds of states that everybody's going to comply with that. And so that's why it's seen by many as this gold standard. If it's a recommendation, even though it might be easier to negotiate, compliance is seen as optional in a way. So there is, for many states, they feel more uncertain because they don't know if, okay, I'm agreeing to this and I'm doing it with the intention of following through, but I don't have the assurance that everybody else is also going to follow through and not just change their mind one day and do something else. So that's why many states insist on having legally binding mechanisms. I think that that is definitely a reasonable goal, but I do believe, and I think this OEWG process sort of highlighted it, that in order to reach a legally binding mechanism, you do need to have very solid common understanding. You really do need to have every state seeing eye to eye on whichever issue it is that you want to create a treaty on. So this OEWG process should be seen as a way to create that common understanding. Eventually, that might lead to something legally binding. That could be great. But we definitely, regardless of what the ultimate goal is, that is really what the focus of this group should be now, this creation of a common ground, so to say. And hopefully, the US, China, Russia will continue to actively engage to ensure that this happens and that we end up having a consensus report in August.
thank you so much. It is so well clear and persuasive, and totally I agree with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Actually, just to complement a bit, and then I will give the floor to Ikuko Kuriyama from our colleague from JAXA and University of Tokyo. I think basically, if the rivals are there, you have to be there. So that's a very simple first answer to this question. But there is also a consideration, I feel, for the OEWG as a whole, that you have to take the question in a reverse way. What if you have recommendations from the OEWG, but the US, Russia, and China were not part of it? What's the value of that? If all the big players are not part of it. So yes, of course, maybe the end goal would not be what we would love to see. So maybe kind of vaguer recommendations, but at least they have some weight if behind there is some form of agreement of the three biggest powers. So yeah, I just wanted to add that. I'm sure if you want to react to that. Or
I 100% agree. And I think the Moon Agreement is a really good example of what you just said.
Mhm.
The Moon Agreement is a treaty that I think it has 18 signatories, and none of the big spacefaring nations are part of it. And in fact, many consider it a failed treaty precisely because of those big players not being signatories or having ratified the treaty. I will also add one other thing, is that if there was consensus about everything, we wouldn't need this group. So it's inevitable that there will be points in which different actors will not agree, or they will have different opinions, because if there weren't, we wouldn't actually be having this conversation.
Of course. And by the way, about the Moon Agreement, there is one major space country that signed it, but quickly regretted it and didn't ratify it, which is France. So that's why France cannot really withdraw from it without ratifying it first, which is a complex issue. Kuriyama-san, I will allow you to speak. Now you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Actually, honestly speaking, I'm not, I don't have much information or knowledge about this theme, but so it may be, my question may be a little bit too basic, but I very enjoyed your lectures and learned very much. And I'm very interested in the OEWG has different features, I mean, framework from other existing old framework, like bottom-up approach, and including many diverse stakeholders, including industries and academia. So, but I just wondering, so if we include diverse stakeholders, it may be difficult to reach consensus again. So my first question is, I think you had already answered this question, but my first question is, so how, so I guess it may be difficult to reach consensus. So how OEWG would like to make consensus on the among different and diverse participants of the participants. And my second question is, if so, you said about there are many discussion points, and also there are diverse opinions among these diverse stakeholders. So what are the most controversial points among participants of the OEWG, or what are the most difficult points to make consensus? Or what do you think about this? So these are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Both of these are really good questions. I agree with you. The more stakeholders you have, the harder it is to reach consensus. And again, this is something that we saw back when the UN was negotiating treaties for space. We saw like a steady decline in terms of people that were willing to sign and ratify treaties. So the Outer Space Treaty was the first one, and it had a lot of states ended up signing and ratifying it. Part of the reason for its success was that it was essentially the US and the then Soviet Union that negotiated it. So when it's just two people sitting at the table negotiating something, is a lot easier to reach an agreement than what happened with the Moon Agreement, which was negotiated 20 years later, and where we had many more spacefaring nations, and therefore many more nations interested in having a seat at the table and a voice in the discussion. And sure, the Moon Agreement had other issues that could be criticized, but in terms of stakeholders, that was an issue, right? There were more people that had something to say, and that led to it's being more difficult to reach consensus. I will say though, I think it's better to have to face this difficulty and take a bit longer to reach consensus on these issues, or having to conform to more general recommendations but have more stakeholders, especially when it comes to something as crucial as space. Everybody uses space. Space has become so essential for humankind as a whole that regardless of whether you are a spacefaring nation, an emerging spacefaring nation, or if you don't have any space asset at all, you still benefit from space services. So you should be there being part of the discussion, because if you don't advocate for your own rights or for your own opinions, priorities, etc., nobody else is going to do it for you. And we've seen this happen in COPIOs. So the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, when they've discussed the peaceful uses of outer space in many respects, one thing that emerging spacefaring actors commonly bring up is that, okay, we are talking about mitigating debris, or we are talking about keeping space sustainable, but essentially it's been a bunch of states that were there first that sort of messed things up for the rest of us, and now we have to comply with more demanding requirements than they had to when they first started space exploration. So perhaps that wouldn't have happened if they had been involved in a discussion from the get-go. And so when it comes to space security discussions, I think that is a lesson learned, in the sense that they definitely want to be part of the discussion, and I think that's really positive. So that is my take on that. The effect definitely will be that it might be difficult to reach consensus. I 100% agree with you, which is why I think we have to take it step by step. I think one of the failures when it comes to addressing space security is that we try to approach every new initiative as like we're going to start from scratch, and that should not be the way that we do things. This OEWG process should sort of, it's going to bring up new things, but it should also rely on the Outer Space Treaty. It should also rely on the issues that were brought up by the group of governmental experts on TCBMs, by the group of governmental experts on legally binding metaphor powers, on the things that states brought up as important during the negotiations for the PPWD. All of those things are relevant for the negotiations of this of these recommendations that we're carrying out right now. And so this is actually another of my pet peeves that I have when it comes to space security regulating. We've talked about space debris, about how bad it is. We've talked about kinetic ASAT testing and how it should be avoided. And I'm so happy that this resolution came about. But space, so these kinetic ASAT tests are not new. The first tests of this nature were carried out in the 50s. And then in like since the 2000s, we've seen several different tests of this kind. And every time a test of this kind was carried out, states said the same thing. They said, this is really bad. We should not do this. But that's it. They didn't back it up by linking those actions to established law, namely the Outer Space Treaty. And I think that if when the first test of this nature happened, they had said, this is really bad, and it actually constitutes, or it could constitute a violation of the Outer Space Treaty, things could have turned a bit different. And I think it was Japan, actually, the country that was the most willing to link these types of tests to violations of the Outer Space Treaty, specifically Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty, which establishes the duty of due regard. If more states had explicitly said, this could be a violation of this article for these reasons, maybe no more tests would have happened and we would have stopped there. So while this resolution is great, I do still see that there is a missing link between the proposal and currently established law. And so that could be a really useful way to encourage that consensus, that new proposals be linked to what's already been done. And I think that's something that's missing. So that would be my personal recommendation to states. Hey, do not forget about currently applicable law. There is no need to reinvent the wheel. And to your second question, what is the most controversial point?
Yeah.
That is really difficult. I don't know. I don't know that I could pinpoint just one issue. I think definitions are always really tough. So I mentioned that there is no clarity on what is a weapon. There is not even clarity on whether we should be defining what a weapon is. A huge controversial issue that has been brought up so far is so there is consensus on the fact that international law applies to outer space. But when it comes to discussing the applicability of IHL, that is to say, international humanitarian law, there are certain states that say it is premature to talk about the applicability of IHL because we are talking about powers, that is to say, the prevention of an arms race in outer space. And IHL, as you might know, deals with the laws that would apply in a conflict. So if we're talking about powers, the argument of these states is that if we're talking about powers, if we're talking about preventing, and we're also saying that we want to discuss how IHL would apply, that means that we're already given up on the prevention. So we should not be discussing IHL yet. It's premature. The majority of states say that, this is not exactly like this, that talking about IHL doesn't actually say that or doesn't admit that prevention has failed. It's just we're preparing. It's better to know what could happen than not be prepared at all. That phrase of he who fails to prepare prepares to fail. That is the approach that most states have. So this is a controversial issue. And we're seeing, so for example, we're seeing the Ukraine war at the moment. We're seeing that space technology is very much part of modern conflict, and this war in Ukraine has sort of highlighted this reality, right? And it's definitely put this issue of the applicability of IHL into focus. And I think it will be interesting to see how these discussions develop. So yes, this I will be interested to see how that turns out. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for your comprehensive answers. It improves a lot of my knowledge. Thank you very much.
Of course, my pleasure.
Thank you very much. And the time is up. So I would.
I'm sorry.
No, you have another question?
No. Thank you so much. I took up a long time. Sorry.
No problem at all. No, I think it was a wonderful lecture, followed by a really wonderful discussion. I'm really glad to see this new format that we are trying functioning to go really in depth on a topic with an expert. So I would like to close the session now by thanking you, Almudena, for taking the time to give this lecture. I know it's already pretty late in the US, so thank you. Thanks a lot for working late for us and for sharing all this knowledge and your experience at the OEWG with us. So yeah, thank you very much.
My pleasure. And I would just like to add, well, again, thank you so much for having me. It was wonderful to chat with you all, and thank you so much for the really interesting questions. Should you have any more questions, well, my contact details are publicly available, but I'm sure that if you ask Quentin, he would be able to provide them as well. Feel free to reach out anytime. I will be happy to get back to you with any answers to any questions that you might have, to the best of my ability. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.